My name is Reverend Faith Lewis, and I'm a United Methodist minister that has been assigned to Lower Marlboro. And the Lower Marlboro Church goes back to 1869 and probably even predates that of when Methodists gathered in this neighborhood in their homes. The history of Methodism is tied to our history as a country, and the Episcopal churches that you see in your community now, especially in Calvert County, they all kind of go right down Route 2. They are our first Protestant presence in a lot of ways, but the Methodist presence has always been a part of Calvert County. And it started in the Church of England. And in the Church of England, there was a group of guys at Oxford who wanted to live out their faith and practice their Christian living a little bit more intentionally than just going to church on Sunday. So Methodism began differently than the way Protestantism began breaking off from the Catholic Church. It really began as people trying to find a method of how to live out their Christian faith. A person could be a Methodist and be a part of an Episcopal church, an Anglican church, because it was really the practice of how they lived their faith out. As our country went through a revolution, it became more important for a person to say, I am a Methodist, versus I am from an Anglican church. And so people in our country had to make a decision to decide that Methodism would live on its own as its own church. And that was not an easy decision. The founder of the Methodist movement, John Wesley, he didn't want the American Anglican churches to split off and become their own church. But really people had to, because when the fighting began, they wanted to identify themselves as not being a part of England. So you had in our country Anglican churches that were the Church of England, and you had people who were Methodists that might have been going to All Saints, or they might have been going to an Episcopal church, but they identified themselves because of how they wanted to live out their faith differently. What were the core things of how the Methodists in Calvert County wanted to live out their faith differently than their Episcopalian neighbors? The key issues for Methodists were around the prohibition of alcohol and the treatment of slaves. So the Episcopal Church wasn't dealing with the use of alcohol and the way that alcohol was tearing up families and the abuse that children and especially women would suffer because of alcohol. So the Methodists became very organized around, let's encourage people not to drink. Let's work to make changes so that alcohol is not prevalent in our communities. And then also around slavery. The Methodists believed that slavery was abomination. They believed that slavery should not happen. It didn't go with Scripture. And that ran contrary to what a lot of other Protestant and Catholics believed at the time. And in some of the journals of Nelson Reed, who in the 1770s was traveling this area, he was finding that the people that he was collecting together as Methodists in the homes, that they were often the poorest people. They were women, they were of a lower economic class, and they were the black slaves as well. This idea that to live out one's faith meant to see people equally, black and white, that it meant having peace in one's home and one's life, and that alcohol was a disturbance to that. Those were key components of Methodism in Calvert County. And our first Methodist meetings of people were in homes. They may have gone to the Episcopal Church to receive a sacrament, or to have their child baptized, but they were really finding that they needed to come together in their homes and live this out. So it really was not until a man named Nelson Reed, a pastor, started circulating on horseback. It would take him a month, and he would start at Friendship, with the town of Friendship just above the Calvert County line. He would start there, and he would go to visit several communities of Methodists. He would go as far down into the middle of the county, but we have his records of coming to Lower Marlboro, Mount Harmony, Smithville, which is in Dunkirk, and Friendship. And he was getting stones thrown at him. People were threatening his life because he was telling people that they shouldn't drink and that slavery was wrong. And so you can't imagine the amount of difficulty it was to be a Methodist at that time. So he did that for many years, circulated around and worked with coming to meet and preach in the fields, in the homes where Methodists were gathering. It wasn't really until after the Civil War that Methodists began to realize it was time to build churches. The pastor of this community on this charge of 3 different communities, his name was Reverend Largent, and he helped the community at Lower Marlboro build their first chapel. They named it Largent's Chapel in honor of him, and it remained named that until really the last 40 years when we named it Lower Marlboro United Methodist Church. Although Methodism began with the passion around being anti-slavery, the passion sort of changed over time, and unfortunately we have a very sketchy past when it comes to actually living out what it is to be an integrated white and black mixture of people when it comes to the worship hour. It is still a very segregated hour. You can go into a United Methodist Church, and especially in Southern Maryland, it's still really divided between the Caucasian and the African American. The United Methodist Church is not all white or all black. It's very diverse. In Calvert County, it's still both. What's unique about Methodism within this area is that we lived it out from having people who did have slaves, having people who were then freed, and all living together and trying to discover what this is as a church and as a community together. And I don't think that we've conquered it and figured it out, but you see how some churches have remained predominantly black, some have remained predominantly white. And although our United Methodist Church could appoint an African American to the church that I serve, and I could be appointed to a black church in Southern Maryland, it still doesn't always happen. In this part of the country, we had the unique division in our history of having some Methodist churches decide that they would side with the South at the Civil War, and some Methodist churches within the same neighborhood side with the North. So the Methodist Church actually split during the Civil War, and a whole nother denomination was formed called Methodist Episcopal South. And in our county, we have churches that were under a whole different bishop that were Methodist Episcopal South. In our Lower Marlboro area, the hall that we call the hall up the road that we do wonderful plays and activities in, that was started as a gathering for the Methodist Episcopal South. They had that building first. So if you can imagine the tension within a small community of folks. When the Civil War was ended and the Methodist Church was united North and South, they gave that building over to the Order of Mechanics, who used that for their lodge meetings and as a community building.